ideas to come up.
Sanjiv, Goenka, given what we have just heard Madhukar say, and given what we heard Vineet talk about, the fact that corporate India or entrepreneurs will actually drive this change, and they will to a large extent, but you still need a flexible political system. You still need a system that actually encourages fresh thinking, new ideas, innovative, out-of-the-box thinking. Given the fact that you actually don't have that at this point in time, it doesn't look like you will in the next 5 to 10 years even. I mean, if you've still got young politicians deciding which constituency they're going to have to fight from because it's a Gujjar-dominated constituency or a Muslim-dominated constituency, let's get real. How do you actually then deal with this demographic dividend or the potential of a demographic dividend when you're operating in that situation?
I think that is about getting elected, and caste does play a role in getting votes. But having said that, let's look at the change that has taken place in the politician. Today you have a Rahul Gandhi who prefers to work his way up. He is preferring to rebuild the Congress in Uttar Pradesh rather than become a minister or become a deputy prime minister or the prime minister, which wouldn't have happened earlier. You've had a Mayawati in the past and you have a Rahul Gandhi now. I mean, look at the contrast. So there is a lot of hope, but having said that, that doesn't take away from the challenge. We have to create infrastructure, education, health, like Shivi said. I mean, all these things. I mean, and it's an impatient generation, impatient to achieve.
Yeah.
And we have to create that infrastructure. So whether it's a politician, whether it's industry, whether it's anyone, I think everyone has to work together in giving this, or creating this.
Okay, Shivinder, let's talk about creating this infrastructure and this ecosystem, and perhaps the most important thing that will actually have to happen is deregulation, that the government actually has a hands-off approach, whether it's healthcare or it's education. That hasn't happened. I know people like you in the healthcare business have had to deal with this issue time and time again. Have you noticed any difference really in that sense?
Shireen, I think your questions and the comments around government and politicians and politics is all hovering around, are we doing the same thing in a different way? I actually feel that there's a lot of change that is happening. I think the last 20 years have seen very significant change in the way government actually interacts with the rest of the world. I think post-liberalization, it may not be drastic, it may not be daily, but there is a sea of change. And you have to just look back 15 years and see what the governments used to do and what they do today. So I think generically, I tend to feel it may not be to the speed you want, and it may not be to the pace, partially because of the vote bank, because you have to carry them along, because they don't come back to power without that. So firstly, I do think that there is a change. Health and education. I think what's happening in the education space today with regards to regulation is fantastic. There is a whole new set of thinking and policy coming around, which will hopefully change some of the challenges we face today going forward. And I totally agree with Vineet. It's not just the 300,000 people who get graduated from engineers. The quality of graduates is awful today. And in our business, what we produced in the 60s and 70s, which have actually run the healthcare system of the world, I'm very sorry to say, we talk about worry. I mean, there's a lot of discussion in our business about we losing. There's nothing to lose because there's no quality coming out today. The 300 medical colleges we have, I mean, if I was a US healthcare provider, I wouldn't touch largely Indian graduates, maybe the top 10 or 12. Earlier, the few that were there, 50, 100 medical colleges, we had best of class, I mean, best of stuff around the world. So quality is certainly going down. But I think the education system that's being talked about, in our own healthcare space, the whole discussion of MCI, the new clinical establishment bill, the act that's coming out, is a very, very positive change.
If we're actually talking about promise and we're talking about potential and we're talking about impatient India actually realizing that promise and that potential, give me a prescription. You as a young corporate leader, what would you like to see? The 5 things that you would like to see happen.
I think the issue is not about what. It's about the timing of the what. Okay. I think all of it will happen.
So what is the timing?
Whatever the 5 things that each of us sit across.
What is your best case scenario and what is your worst case scenario?
So it's a hope issue. I mean, I would want infrastructure, health, education to be sorted out tomorrow morning. It's not going to happen. But if it gets happened within this term, whether it's policy, whether it's implementation, and you set the roadworks going today for stuff that's going to happen, whatever time frame it takes. I cannot change the timing of power plants, whether I want to or not, but I can create, instead of working incrementally on 100 megawatts, I can try and create maybe 10 or 10,000 megawatts, put the foundation stones in place. It'll come in a couple of years. So I think the issue today that we are grappling with as a country is not what, it's when. It's a question of the speed dial. can you speed it up? Because it's going to happen anyway. The country will force you to make it happen. The vote bank that didn't even want stuff yesterday or did not think that they could influence it today, they changed governments today because they are either happy or not happy with the way governments deliver. So I think everything that we talk about will happen. Will happen in my lifetime or his lifetime? That's the question.
You know, Shumit, since we are talking about bridging the deficits, and we're seeing these deficits play out on every front in every sector at this point in time, if we're talking about giving a policy response a little bit more room, because we know how the government actually operates, corporate India is going to try and do its bit. How do you actually ensure that what we are seeing, not just across one state in India at this point in time, but 7 or 8 or 9 states, the Maoist issue, the Naxal issue, this is an issue of economic differences. How do you actually deal with that when you're saying that we'll give the policy response 5 years or 10 years or 15 years because that's how the government operates? They're not going to wait for you.
I actually, I'm not close enough to some of this to comment, but I do think that the policy and political language out of the country in the last 15 years is radically different than what it was. I think that's clear and evident. I'm talking about something quite different, which is to get stuff to happen, the administrative delivery machinery in small villages needs to just operate at a different level than it does. And I think making those changes happen is not trivial. I think that the professionalization of the civil service in that sense, is really what I'm talking about. That you have to find a way to make that happen. And how that happens, I don't know on this scale. I think that what is very clear is that the kinds of numbers at hand are very large, and I think that it's probably not acceptable to think about this in terms of long horizons for a different reason than Shivander's, right? Which is that you'd like to see it happen sooner, but I think there's a bit more urgency than that, which is that very large numbers of low-skilled or unskilled people in the economy and in the society are inherently unstable. I think that's just and regions that have that kind of profile will be more and more problematic. I mean, I think the circumstances in Brazil are very, very clear evidence of this. I think that the inability of Brazil to convert about half of that potential demographic dividend into productive workforce has been very expensive for Brazil. I think it makes, for example, urban circumstances to operate in Sao Paulo and Rio virtually impossible. It's just a very difficult situation. So I think there is a bit more urgency to it than the aspiration of delivering goodness to people.
Vineet Nair, how worried are you about this problem? The fact that we haven't been able to sufficiently bridge the economic differences, in fact, they're enhancing.
So Shireen, I can definitely see that politicians are a big stick in this discussion. Just came back from US in a G100 meeting which Jack Welch was hosting, and I can tell you the environment there was the same, that everybody hates the US politicians, and we are no different. Why don't we for a minute assume that all politicians are the same and they will take their own sweet spot, sweet time to go from here to there? The question I always ask is, okay, so we should be urgent, and we always say they should do this, policy should change, politicians should change. Why don't for a minute we say that different countries are dealing with different challenges. We have Moi's challenge, we have a government challenge. Yeah, it is better today than yesterday, and Obama has a different challenge. Let's talk about the previous question which you talked about. Outside that, what can you do? And I think the business leaders of today owe it to the young generation to come up with business plans and business ideas which are global in outlook, which will help us establish our global leadership. Our thought leaders, we should be the thought leaders. Management philosophies, our way of doing healthcare, our way of doing IT.
So give me specifics. You deal with 25-year-olds every day, Vineet. Give me specifics on what your outlook for them would be, or what your mission statement or vision for them would be.
My mission statement is already in public: destroy the office of the CEO. I believe that the CEO is the biggest problem we have in our country. It represents the fact that we believe in democracy, and we've talked about democracy, but we run our companies like autocratic, family houses. And if you continue doing that, you can't preach to politicians what you don't practice within the organization.
Sanjiv is smiling away. Sanjiv, do you have a comment on that? The most autocratic office is the CEO's office?
I talked about my office.
No, I wasn't suggesting that he's running his company like that. Go ahead, Sanjiv.
Well, I think having a CEO does not mean you're not being democratic. And And at the end of the day, there has to be somebody who takes decisions, somebody who calls the shots, and somebody who's accountable eventually to all the stakeholders. And to my mind, and I disagree with Vineet, that any system which does not have one boss eventually cannot work.
Okay. All right, let's get down to prescriptions. Madhukar, let me start by asking you, because, again, as I sense consensus really that it is going to be the common man or the citizen that is going to drive most of this.